Hello and welcome to the last talk on philosophy of perception. This is going to look at the problems of idealism, some of the issues that come up for Berkeley's idealism, which are quite profound, really. There's four key problems with idealism. First is that idealism probably leads to solipsism, especially if you're an atheist and find the belief in God untenable. Secondly, idealism cannot make sense of objective space and time, which seems to be key to, at least in some sense, to our understanding of objectivity, of science, at least in its Newtonian versions. And idealism cannot make sense of illusions and hallucinations. Finally, God cannot be used to ground idealism in the way that Berkeley uses God, and we'll look at that. So idealism leads to solipsism. Solipsism is the belief that all that exists is your mind and ideas in your mind. So it's very unusual. I'm not sure I've only ever heard of a philosopher actually believe it. But the claim is idealism may lead to this. Well, why? Solipsism is the belief that my mind and the ideas in my mind exist, and that I only perceive and have experience of ideas in my mind and have no experience of another mind. Why should I believe in other minds at all? So, in other words, if Berkeley's correct and there's only mind and ideas in the mind, given a common kind of principle of knowledge, which is you believe the things one has had experience of, especially in the empiricist tradition, well, we have no experience of other minds. We only have experience of our minds and ideas, right? So, unless you believe in God as the cause of the ideas in your mind, you're left with only those two things. And that's majorly problematic. There's a funny story of someone writing to Bertrand Russell, telling him that they were solipsist, and he famously wrote back saying, well, why did you bother writing to me if you're really a solipsist? It's quite an absurd position to really hold. Yet it could possibly be the kind of thing that one might go to if one took idealism seriously enough. The second problem is idealism cannot make sense of objective space and time, right? So what's the point here? I mean, obviously there's subjective space, subjective time, specifically subjective time. If something's boring, it will feel a lot longer than if it was exciting. If something if a journey is very, very tedious and long and difficult, then it will feel significantly longer than a short, pleasant first-class journey on a nice plane, right? So there's how we perceive time, there's our experience of it, and then there's time itself, the time that's measured effectively by clocks, or at least the atomic clock. And the claim here is that, well, there is objective space and time, and yet if Berkeley's right, that can't be the case. We just have minds and ideas in the mind, and ergo, time just is how it feels. Right? So that would kind of lead us potentially into a problem with science. If idealism's true and ideas are simply in mind, and then it makes no sense to distinguish between subjective space and time and objective space and time. Indeed, subjective space and time is the only space and time there is. It's my mind, my experiences, and my ideas. And even if there's a mind of God, his mind presumably has subjectivity to it as well. So. Thirdly, idealism can't make sense of illusions and hallucinations. So if you remember back to direct realism and indirect realism, there was the whole issue of the fact that what we perceive and what we think that our perception is about, or sense data is about, two different things. Now, we make sense of that claim by saying, well, what I'm seeing is not how the thing actually is, right? The pencil is straight, what I'm seeing is crooked, ergo I'm not seeing the pencil as it is. But that makes sense of illusions. But if Berkeley's right, and there's no external object, there's no substratum, there's no subject, there's no substance, then the ideas are all there is. And so what then makes that a hallucination? What makes, or the illusion, wrong? Why does it mislead us? If ideas are all that exists without external objects that cause them, then my mind of a crooked pencil in the water is all that exists. The claim that there is a real straight pen that caused it makes no sense. Ergo, there are no illusions. This just seems absurd. Okay, so Berkeley's having issues here really with objectivity and with our claims on that. Fourth, God can't be used to ground idealism, and this is really rooted in the claim that, well, God being transcendent, that means outside space and time, God being outside the physical universe, his ideas, his experience of his ideas are not going to be temporal, they're not going to be like ours, right? So if ideas are in the mind of God, they can't be anything like the ideas that we have of his ideas. And there's no reason to think that ideas cannot originate in the mind of God. That's true, but ideas and perceptions belong to me and not to God. Too, God cannot have identical ideas to me, as that would imply experience of finite time, space, and even suffering. My ideas are temporal, and God's cannot be temporal, right? So therefore, God and I cannot share the same ideas. To make this just really simple, it's just like we can't share in the ideas in the mind of God because they're completely different. Right? God doesn't experience time. God doesn't experience suffering. So how do our ideas reflect ideas in the mind of God? We have all of those things. So the nature of God effectively makes it impossible that he grounds ideas. Well, Berkeley does respond to these in greater or lesser detail, so let's have a look. How might he respond to the threat of solipsism? Berkeley doesn't deal with solipsism straight off because he wasn't concerned about it, but he does claim that although in theory there might be no minds outside our own, we can infer the existence of minds with our knowledge of our own mind. After all, my intuition of my own mind allows me to postulate the possible existence of other minds without contradiction. So Berkeley is effectively saying, in kind of the same way that Descartes can intuit his existence, Berkeley can intuit his mind, or we can intuit that we have minds. We can intuit the mind as a kind of subject of experience, and we can therefore postulate the possible existence of other minds. There's no contradiction in thinking that they're there, and we can infer them. Okay, so although Berkeley doesn't say he's proved that, he thinks it's totally reasonable, the best hypothesis to make. The response to the threat of objective space and time can reasonably be countered and rebutted by Berkeley. He can simply say that objective space and time as it's understood from the perspective of God. Here Berkeley can claim that God's understanding and knowledge of ideas as they are in his mind just is the ground of objective space and time. Right? So God has objectivity. God's understanding, knowledge, cognizance, and apprehension are what objectivity is. If you want to know something objectively, you have to be in the mind of God. As I said, that kind of makes sense. Remember, this was an important thing in the medieval philosophy and theology, and so I think so long as one believes in God, there's a reasonable way of kind of grounding objective space and time there. As regards to the problem of hallucinations, it's difficult for Berkeley, really. I don't think he succeeds here. Hallucinations are just less clear and coherent than normal experiences, and there's no difference in their ontological status, claims Berkeley. Right? So in fact, Berkeley's going to say, well, look, the difference between hallucination and a real perception, so to speak, is that in a hallucination there's less coherence to it. It's either less vivid or too vivid, and there's something wrong with the sense experience, but they are ontologically, as regards what they are, they're an equal status to our ideas in our mind, right? That seems a bit problematic, although it's difficult to justify that without kind of begging the question. I mean, why should reality be more coherent than unreality? That itself isn't clear, and Berkeley can just say just that. You know, we shouldn't postulate that reality is always going to be more coherent than unreality. He can also claim that the difference between hallucinations and normal perceptions is that hallucinations have their origin in our mind and not in the mind of God. Although that may be true, it does leave us wondering how that relationship works. I mean, presumably if we can think up ideas, then God must have known they were there because he has ideas in his mind as well. So I think, again, the real problem here is one of objectivity. How does he tie objectivity? And then ultimately it has to all go back to God for Berkeley. Okay, so unless one believes in God and finds that convincing, it's quite difficult to accept idealism at all.